It was a cold, foggy night in the small town of Greystone. The moon hung low, casting pale light on the old, overgrown graveyard at the edge of town. Niev, Soren, and Emrys, 3 close friends, stood at the entrance, staring at the iron gates. "Are you sure about this?" Emrys asked, his voice shaking slightly. He was tall, with messy hair and a nervous expression. His friends had dared him to stay in the graveyard until midnight. Niev, a brave girl with wild red hair and piercing green eyes, grinned. "Come on, Emrys, it's just a few hours. What's the worst that could happen?" Soren, quieter than the others. His eyes were always calm, but tonight, even he seemed uneasy. "It's just old stones and dead people. Nothing to be scared of." Emrys swallowed hard, looking at the graveyard. The shadows between the tombstones seemed to move in the mist. He sighed, knowing he couldn't back out now. "All right," he muttered, stepping forward. "But if I die, you two are haunted forever." Niev laughed. "Deal." They opened the rusty gate with a loud creak and entered. The air inside the graveyard was colder, almost biting. The wind whispered through the trees, making the branches sway like skeletal fingers reaching for them. Emrys shuddered. "Midnight," Niev reminded him, checking her watch. "We'll come back for you then." They left Emrys alone, walking back to the gate. He looked around at the rows of tombstones. Most were old, cracked, and covered in moss. Some were so worn that the names were impossible to read. He found a large stone and sat down, trying to stay calm. The silence around him grew louder. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the graves. "Nothing to worry about," he told himself. "It's just my imagination." But then, from behind one of the graves, he heard a sound, a soft, scratching noise. His breath caught. He stood up, looking around, but saw nothing. The fog was getting thicker, making it harder to see. He took a step forward, his heart racing. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the mist, standing by an ancient tombstone. "Who's there?" Emrys called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. Emrys's hands were shaking as he watched the shadowy figure. It didn't move, but it was definitely there. A tall, thin shape, too far to see clearly, but close enough to feel its presence. Emrys could hear his own breathing, fast and uneven. He slowly backed away, but the figure remained still. Who are you?" Emrys whispered, his voice barely audible. Still no answer. The fog swirled around the tombstones like a living thing, and Emrys couldn't tell if the figure was a person or something else. His mind raced. Was this a trick? Were Niev and Soren trying to scare him? He reached for his phone, but his fingers were trembling too much to dial. "Your text here." He glanced at the time. It was only 10:30. Still so far from midnight. He felt like the night was stretching out, becoming longer than it should be. As he looked back toward the figure, it was gone. His heart jumped in his chest. "Okay, calm down. It's just your mind playing tricks," he muttered to H. But he didn't believe his own words. Suddenly, a voice whispered behind him, soft but clear. "You shouldn't be here." Emrys spun around, his heart pounding in his throat. There was no one behind him, but he could still feel someone watching. He backed up, almost tripping over a stone, and broke into a run, heading for the gate. As he reached the iron gate, he grabbed it and pulled. It wouldn't move. Panic shot through him as he tried again, but it was locked. He looked around, desperate. Where were Niev and Soren? Just then, he heard footsteps approaching from the fog. Slow, deliberate footsteps. He turned, and there it was again, the figure now closer. He could see it more clearly, and it looked human, but its face was hidden in shadows. You need to leave," Emrys shouted, his voice cracking. But the figure didn't stop. Emrys's mind raced. He was trapped, and the figure was getting closer. It seemed to glide more than walk, its movements unnatural. Emrys backed against the gate, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped. The figure stood still, just a few feet away. Then, without a sound, it raised a hand and pointed at the oldest part of the graveyard, where the tombs were almost hidden under vines and roots. Emery stared in disbelief. What do you want?" he whispered. The figure said nothing, but kept pointing. Emery hesitated, then, against every instinct, he slowly began walking in the direction it indicated. The figure followed silently, always just behind him. He didn't dare look back. As he reached the ancient tombstones, he noticed something strange. One of the graves was open, a dark, yawning hole in the earth. His stomach twisted with fear. The figure stopped at the edge of the grave, staring down into the blackness. "Go in," the figure whispered, its voice like the wind through. Emery shook his head, trembling. No, I can't." Suddenly, the figure moved forward, pushing him toward the grave. Emery struggled, his feet slipping on the wet ground. But then, out of nowhere, a shout broke through the air. "Emery's!" It was Niamh's voice, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Emery turned his head to see Niamh and Soren rushing toward him. The figure by the grave suddenly vanished, melting into the fog as if it had never been there. Niamh grabbed Emery's arm, pulling him away from the grave. "Are you okay? We've been looking for you." Soren stared at the open grave, his face pale. "What happened here?" Emery looked back at the empty grave, his body still shaking. I don't know. But we need to leave. Now." They didn't ask any more questions. Together, the three friends ran for the gate. This time it opened easily, and they rushed out into the cold night air, never looking back. As they walked away from the graveyard, Emery glanced over his shoulder one last time. The mist was thicker than ever, but in the distance, he could just make out the shadowy figure standing by the grave, watching them leave.